Please join me in welcoming Jacob Jeannot-Schroeder from DICE. Are you with us?
Yes, can you hear me? Hello.
Yes, we can hear you. Hi, how are you?
I'm good. How are you doing?
Good, thank you. Where are you right now? Are you home?
I'm at home. Yes, I'm in my bedroom this fine day.
Cool. I'm gonna leave the stage to you. Go ahead.
All right, thank you so much. So I'll share my screen. Let me know if you can see this. Looks like good. Okay, so thank you, everyone. Hello, and thank you for the introduction. I'm really excited to be able to join this conference virtually. It's been great to see some of the talks that people have given throughout to hear some industry leaders in the Swedish games field. My name is Jacob Jeannot-Schroeder. I'm a senior UX researcher at DICE Electronic Arts. And what I want to talk to you about today is how game industry developers will effectively make use of prototypes to find the fun in their games to improve the quality of the overall player experience. So Electronic Arts is a game publisher that makes some of the world's most played games, many of which you can see here. And we understand that making games is really complicated. And to make the development of our games less complicated, we try to gain confidence in the design of our games early on as best we can, so that we know that when we go to build something, we're doing the right thing. And one of the ways of several that we can go about trying to do this is by using prototypes. And by prototypes, I mean building a really focused version of one or more features that end up making it into the game, and then testing that prototype with real players, and then seeing how it holds up. So today I'll start by talking about why it matters to prototype. And to put it simply, we prototype so that we can find problems in our design early on in the game's development and fail fast, rather than learning some really hard lessons later on in the game's development when it's too late to sort of make any changes. Then I'll talk about what features that make up a game matter most to prototype. And we want to prototype features that are risky. Those are the ones that we have a lot of unanswered questions about. And we'll want to try and find ways to answer some of those unanswered questions. And lastly, I'll point to some of the ways that we create effective prototypes that provide useful feedback to us by targeting experiential outcomes. So how do we create prototypes that aren't just create a prototype for the sake of creating it, but getting something useful out of it that helps us improve the design of that feature? So again, we want to be able to find ways to gain confidence in our game's design. And for prototyping, the first thing to think about was why do we need to prototype in the first place? But before I talk about why we prototype to improve our games, I want to give you sort of a really high level overview of what it looks like to make games at Electronic Arts and pretty much every big game publishing company out there. So no matter how big a game eventually is going to get, games often start with a really small team of developers, and that small group of developers is going to come up with a pitch for a new game concept, a vision for a game that gets everyone really excited to go out and make this really cool new game that they want to make. And then from there, the team's going to get a little bit bigger. But before they jump straight into making the game, they're going to plan how they're actually going to do it. They're going to figure out what is it actually going to take to make this game. And in a big game, this means planning for hundreds of developers that are going to end up making the game. And then once a good plan's in place, they'll set out to put those hundreds of developers that they plan for actually put to work producing the game. And then really obscure here, but they'll then spend a lot of time producing the game, and then hopefully they'll end up with something that millions of players around the world are going to end up playing and enjoying. So just from this really high level overview, you can see some of the challenges that it goes into making a AAA game. One of the specific things there is it requires just massive teams to be able to accomplish. And this huge team is going to be comprised of a bunch of highly specialized disciplines, individuals from highly specialized disciplines. And they're all going to bring their own expertise into making this game. And everybody that's a part of making this game is going to be needs to be aligned on a pretty highly subjective and really difficult to describe endpoint. They want to make a game that's fun. But what is going to make for an enjoyable player experience is not something that's easy to point to and say, this is a fun experience, go make that. So one of the ways we want to make sure we're doing the right things is to smartly prototype features of the game and to validate them before we spend a ton of effort building those features in the game software. So to do this, we prototype with a purpose in mind. We try to get feedback from players through playtesting. We lean on these user-centered design principles here to be able to iterate on a game using player feedback. So to answer the question of why do we want to prototype, we prototype so that we can validate features in the game before we spend a lot of time and effort on them. We want to prototype so that we can fail fast early on. And then we can do so cheaply, again, before we sort of commit to some costly code. Then the next step about gaining confidence in our game's design is to figure out what should be prototyped. And for this, I want to give a lot of credit to Fozzie Mesmar. Fozzie is a longtime industry vet. He's currently the head of design at DICE. And he gave this talk to the UX team over here about lessons that he learned when prototyping through his career. And one of the things I want to pull inspiration from, as he shared, is how to determine what exactly are the best features that we want to prototype early on. So one of the steps we go through in the planning phase of the development that I talked about is we break the game into its component parts. So this is an example of what some of the features in a game could look like. This is a completely fake game. I'm not thinking of anything in particular. It's a generic, let's say, multiplayer shooter video game. So I've made this up for the purpose of the presentation, but know that in a AAA shooter like a game I'm talking about here would have many orders of magnitude more features than what's listed here. But this gives a good example of the types of things that a game team will need to plan for. So in a shooter game, there needs to be a variety of maps. Maps are where in the game world the action takes place. So we need to have a plan for how we're going to develop maps. In this particular generic game that I'm talking about, maybe there's vehicles as well. So that's another feature that'll need to be planned for. And then we also need to think about the user interface that tells players what is happening in the game. We call this the heads-up display or the HUD. And then lastly, as an example of feature that we need to plan for, we need to be able to teach new players how to play, and we'll do this through the onboarding process. So what I want to do is walk through how we can take a list of features like this and identify what are those features that are most important to prototype so that we can test early on and start improving the design. So first, we'll assess each feature by determining how confident we are that that feature design is going to work. And by confident, I mean having answers to questions like, what is it going to cost to build this feature? How much effort is going to be required to be able to test this feature? So if a feature is going to be expensive and timely to make, our confidence in that feature success is going to be a bit lower. We'll assess the importance of a feature next to the importance of the overall game success of that feature of each feature. And by importance, I mean having answers to questions like what is going to make this game stand out? Where are people spending the most of their time in the game? And those features that are unique or make up the bulk of the player experience are going to be more important to the game's overall success. And then once we assessed our features, we can start laying them out on a grid. And we'll start with the confidence, let's say, of each of the feature, how confident we are in each of the features' success. And we'll plot it on a grid here. Let's start from how uncertain to certain we are on that feature. So if we continue our generic shooter game example, let's say as a studio, we have a fairly high confidence that we're going to be able to make maps that are compelling. We think we can do that pretty well. And that's mostly the same with vehicles and even more so with the HUD, with the game UI. But for onboarding, this might be an area that's we should potentially be a little bit less confident. Shooter games in particular tend to be pretty difficult to teach new players because they're the types of games that reward high skill as well as high knowledge. And as a result, shooter games tend to be a little bit less new player friendly. So we might be a little bit less certain that we can make an onboarding that successfully teaches new players. And as we did with the confidence of each feature, we'll then plot the importance of each feature, this time on the y-axis from less critical to the game's overall success. So if we start on the right with the heads-up display, this isn't we can say that maybe this is a little bit less critical to the game we're building. This doesn't indicate that the game UI isn't an important feature. It just means relative to all the other features that make this game, it's not going to be the thing that makes or breaks it. You can imagine in a different game, maybe there's a really unique twist on the game UI that is really critical to get to get right, and is going to be really important for the game. But for this one, it is not the case. So we can say it's less critical. Vehicles also, maybe they play an important role in the gameplay of our game, but they're not where players are going to be spending the bulk of our time or the bulk of their time. So we can also put those as a little bit less critical. Maps, on the other hand, are going to be important. Maps in shooter games tend to be very standout things. It's what a lot of players will remember the most, and the mastery of maps is often where players will spend a lot of effort. And then lastly, onboarding is also going to be critical to the game's success, as it's both how we teach new players to play, but it's also everyone's first experience with the game. So it's really important that the onboarding, it's really critical the onboarding gets right for this game's success. So if we finish the example here, we end up with something that looks like this. We got our features plotted on a grid like this. So this process of evaluating features by our confidence of the feature's design, as well as the importance of each feature to the overall game success, makes it really easy to identify what are the features we should be prototyping or we should look at in some capacity, because it shows us which features we're uncertain about, but are also really critical to get right. And we would call these features risky, and they're risky because we don't have we have concerns about them. So to answer the question, what do we prototype? We'll prototype these risky features so they can be evaluated early on before we build them, so we can get answers to those questions we have that are making it so we're a little less certain about them. And in this case, in our fake example game, we should find ways to prototype and then evaluate the onboarding in some capacity. So, and then the last step for gaining early confidence about a game's design is how to actually build a prototype that's going to get us something useful. Again, something that helps us with the design to improve it in some way. How are we going to build something that does that? And when thinking about how to prototype, it's important to remember, think back, why did we want to prototype in the first place? And again, that was so that we could fail fast and get answers to unanswered questions we might have about a feature. And because of that, we actually need to reverse the order on these user-centered design principles when we go to build a prototype. We need to think about what feedback is important to us that's going to help us improve the design, help us de-risk these risky features. And then what feedback we need to know will then inform us how we want to build the prototype. So to think about what feedback is important, then we want to build with a purpose. And to do that, we'll craft user stories from the player's perspective, thinking about specifically who is going to be using this feature, what is it that they're going to be doing when they experience it, and why are they using this feature. So picking back up on this fake game example, we talked about the onboarding as a potential thing. Because it's risky, we want to sort of evaluate and test this onboarding in some way. So let's follow it up. Let's make a statement about onboarding, something that we want to achieve with the onboarding. We'd have a lot of user stories for each feature, but we could provide one that looks something like this. So as a returning player, I want to refresh my understanding of the controls so I can quickly get back into the game. So one of our objectives of several that we have for the onboarding, we know who it is that we're trying to build this for. That is returning players. We know what it is those returning players are trying to do. They're trying to refresh their understanding of the game controls. And we know why they're doing it, so they can quickly get back into the game. So from creating user stories like this, we know what it is we're trying to accomplish from the onboarding, from the player's perspective, and then we can build a prototype that tries to represent that experience to see how well we're able to achieve those goals. And then we also need to determine how much effort we should go into making the prototype that we've identified here. And again, we're not looking to build the onboarding, so we shouldn't spend a whole bunch of effort. We're trying to build an approximation of the onboarding so that we can test it before we build it. So we should spend as little effort as we possibly can building the prototype. So we need to determine what level of fidelity is going to be needed to be able to validate the goals that we set up within those user stories. And one way to do that is to think about what level of functional integration versus asset quality is going to be required to adequately deliver on that intended player experience. And by functional integration, I mean what level of code functionality is going to be needed to be able to represent the feature. Asset quality, what level of art or content is going to be needed to be able to represent that feature. And for onboarding, there's many ways that we could build a prototype to sort of evaluate the onboarding. At the high end of both these axes, you get something that looks like the finished product. This is the onboarding level that ships with the game. It's the tutorial level everybody plays that teaches them how to play the controls. But we don't need to have a high functioning, high asset quality prototype to be able to answer useful questions about an experience. What we want to do is test the parts that are going to eventually make that onboarding level fun. So take, for example, the text instructions that the game is going to try to teach players, what it is that they're trying to teach. So we could create mock-ups of this text, get player feedback on those. We don't have any need at all for any functional integration. This isn't going to the game. Maybe this is just some sort of mock-up we show players and then they go play. And we see if the text that we're trying to teach players worked in the goals that we have. We could take it a step further. We could take that mock-up text, put it into a sort of white box level, and now we have a little bit more interactability, similar to what we're trying to achieve with the finished product, the onboarding level, but not to the level of polish or art quality that we're the final sort of state of this is going to look like. But it's ultimately it's our user stories that we set in mind that is going to determine how much functionality and how much art polish is going to be required of prototype. Because again, we want to try to approximate the stories that we have. How do we best do that? We do need to have high functionality, high asset quality to create a fun experience that like you see in the eventual onboarding level. But what creates and enables that experience to be fun are the smaller pieces that feed into it. So what we're testing for is not fun, it's the specific components that make something fun. And it's by testing these specific experiences using prototypes of the features that we determine to be risky that lets us find the fun in our games to improve the overall quality of the features that we're setting out to prototype. So to recap here on what I've talked about, as a game team, we need to know that we're making the right thing before we actually go out and build it. We do that by setting ourselves up to fail fast, to find problems early. We find out what are the features in the game that are most at risk, and then we build a prototype that focuses on the experience outcomes that feature is trying to solve. And we have the goal of that throughout all this is putting that prototype in front of players to answer the questions we have about that experience. What exactly is making it risky? And the result of this prototyping effort is we end up getting useful feedback about that risky feature we identified. And that's going to save us development resources when we do go and try to build it. So with that, I'll sort of open up to questions either from the audience or from the Discord.
All right. Thank you so much for your presentation, Jacob.
Absolutely.
We have maybe some time for questions. I don't see anything on screen right now, so I will start off with a question myself.
Sure.
So, like you talked so much about like prototype, and that it was really really interesting. But like, which teams are involved in this prototyping process, and how many people would be doing this process for a game?
Yeah, great question. I guess it depends on sort of what is the feature we're looking at. Is if it's like a very art-centric feature, we want to know how people are going to feel about the art style. That would be a type of prototype in itself. And then the artists are very involved, and they'll sort of put together some concepts that we can put in front of players. If it's something more gameplay-centric, maybe we have a small team of developers that are looking, let's say on the vehicle example, we want to see if the vehicles are fun to play, then we can build a level to try and assess that. And now we need a small team to be able to create something that represents the vehicles as they would be in the final game. Oftentimes we're working with a UX team. They're going to create prototypes of menu flows and things like that using tools like Adobe XD or just like PowerPoint presentations. So really it depends on what feature we're talking about, but the scope of it is sort of dependent on that, but we'll also really be working closely with the UX team primarily in these types of prototype conversations.
Cool. Thank you so much.